Thank you for joining me for another render optimization video. Today, I'm going to talk about reducing fireflies in your renders using the clamping setting, which is one of the render settings in Blender. Clamping allows you to render faster, get a cleaner result faster, and especially it helps reduce the issue of fireflies. And if you don't know what fireflies is, I'll show it on the screen, but it's like some pixels in your render that are surrounded by relatively dark pixels are super bright and they look like fireflies. So this is going to be another, render optimization video, which is more in line with what Blender Grid is supposed to be. BlenderGrid.com, in case you don't know, allows you to upload your blend file and render it very fast, faster than you could do with your own computers. And so it's pretty much solving the problem of rendering being slow. But there are other ways that you can solve this. The way Blender Grid solves it is using a lot of computers, just speeding it up that way. But there are other things you can do, especially if you know all the render settings and what they do. It allows you to render a lot more efficiently, and meaning faster, cheaper, all of the good stuff. So today, clamping. Clamping, I think it has been around since cycles existed because clamping is pretty simple, especially if you think about the implementation. It's a pretty simple thing to do. And I will talk more about how it works later in the video, but first I want to show what it can do and what it looks like in a practical example. And I think we've done one video about clamping back in the day, but that was before the setting changed. So now, since Blender, I guess somewhere 3-ish, clamping has been split into direct and indirect light, which is 2 values. And it used to be only 1 value, which is a little bit less, gives you less control. Having it in direct and indirect is really useful, and it's even so good now that Blender by default turns on indirect light clamping, and it sets it at 10 by default because it's pretty much a good idea to do this in any scene. So if you don't have time to watch the rest of this video, what you should know about clamping is the lower the setting, the more effect it has. Until you hit 0. 0 is turning it off, but 0.1 is like a really big effect, and I would not recommend that. So the lower the setting, the more effect it has on your render. The upside is it can reduce noise faster, it can reduce fireflies. The downside is it reduces accuracy, and more specifically, it reduces the brightness of certain places in your render, and it makes them darker than they should physically be. So it makes the render less physically accurate. But the upsides are that you get faster, noise-free results, and you can reduce fireflies a lot quicker this way. So for the example scene, I went into the demo files at blender.org again, because this is just really nice. If you can use one of these, it's very accessible. Anyone can download them for free. And I chose this time this Barcelona scene, this ArcVis outdoor demo from eMirage. And it's great. You would not assume that there's going to be a lot of fireflies in looking at this render, but they have 3 different lighting setups for the same scene. And the nighttime version is great. It's a great example for showing fireflies. And so I have set this from the default is the number 1, the midday. I set it to number 3, night. And if we take a look at what this looks like, we will see a lot of fireflies. And before I do that, I just want to show you my render settings. So we're rendering the cycles, and there's nothing crazy going on. I've turned off the noise threshold, so I've turned off adaptive sampling. I just set the samples to a simple low-ish value of 256. I've turned off denoising, And then we have here the clamping settings set to 0 and 10, which is the default. But first I want to show the Fireflies by completely turning off clamping by setting both to 0. And if you hover above this, you can see if non-zero, then this will do something. If it's 0, then it's pretty much turned off. All right, so let's take a look at a render. And the default resolution for this scene is 720p, which is pretty low, but it's perfect for this example. And I can zoom in on this, and here you can already start to see the Firefly problem going on. And if we make this a little bit bigger, we can see the whole image. And let's put it there. And let's wait for this to finish. I hope my screen recording will not be messed up by using the GPU for rendering while recording, but we're gonna see and find out. And that's done. Took 40 seconds, and as you can see, there's a massive amount of Fireflies going on in this scene. So that's the issue. You can solve this issue in various different ways. You can increase the samples, but I've tested this, and even rendering at like 500,000 samples still gives you a lot of noise from Fireflies. So you need to do something else. You can do denoising, but we're gonna look, in this video, we're gonna look at clamping. So I wanna go back to this. Now I wanna move to a different slot so we can compare, and then turn on set clamping to the default setting, which is 0 and 10. And just hit render again to see what the difference is. And as you can see, it starts off looking like there's gonna be a lot of Fireflies again, but the Fireflies are just a lot less bright. And that's because we are clamping those bright light paths, are those bright samples we take for those pixels. So you can kind of still see the same pixels being brighter than the surrounding ones, but it's a lot less extreme. And this is a lot better for a, let's say, a denoiser to work with and to just clean up the image. But what we're losing is some of the accuracy and some of the brightness in those areas where there were a lot of Fireflies before. So now we can compare slot 2 with 1, and that's the difference. So it reduces those Fireflies by a lot. And this is what Blender has set the clamping values to by default. But we're also losing a lot of accuracy. And I've also prepared this and rendered this at very high sample counts with and without clamping. And then we can see what that does. But before I show that, I want to turn up, or I want to turn on the direct light clamping as well. So set that to 10 as well. This is what it's used to be before we could split them. Before we could split these into two numbers, there was just a single value that you could set. So if you set that to 10, then it would pretty much be the same as setting both direct and indirect to the same value. So let's jump back to the render view and go to slot 3 to render a third version of this image and see what that does. And as you can see, it's pretty similar to only clamping the indirect samples, but we can see, especially at this wall, we can see those bright spots are kind of gone. So if we compare that with 2, this is clamping only the indirect light, and this is clamping the both direct and indirect. So we're just losing a bit of that brightness on that wall. However, the rest of the image looks very similar. So this is no clamping at all. This is only indirect clamping, and this is the both clamping, indirect and direct. And in general, and looking at what Blender does by default, only setting the indirect light, that's the safest option, to only clamp your indirect light paths and just leave the direct light untouched. So keeping this at 0, that's the safest option. That's what Blender does by default. So pretty much what you should know about direct and indirect is that direct has a lot more of a extreme effect on the image than the indirect clamping. And later I will show you the actual difference between direct light and indirect light clamping. But let's look at some higher quality renders that I did before. So this is what it's supposed to look like without any clamping. So this is physically accurate, more or less. There is still some denoising going on, so it's not 100% physically accurate, but this is pretty much the brightness values that you would get if it's physically accurate. Then the next one is only indirect clamping, and you can see those areas here get a lot less light and it looks less nice. It looks less realistic, especially if you have seen this one. You're kind of missing something. And then the third one, direct set to 10 and indirect also to 10. That's where you really see those specific spots on the wall getting a lot less bright. It doesn't go to 0 because we're still clamping, we're still allowing 10 to pass through, but anything above 10 will be clamped down to 10. And a little bit on this flower here, you can see, gets darker. And that's pretty much what the setting does in a practical example. So that's all. It's pretty simple. And yeah, it reduces fireflies. This is without any clamping. This is with clamping. And this is with both settings set. So what I would recommend for this scene is setting something to, setting the direct light to 0 or something really high, maybe 30 or something. And setting the indirect light to 10 or even less. If you, especially if you need to do an animation with this, because then you can give the denoiser a lot cleaner image by, yeah, giving it this rather than this. And yeah, that's what I generally recommend. All right, so if we look at, let's say, I'm just gonna start a new file here and look at it from the top and turn on my drawing. All right, so we have a basic scene here. We have a camera, we have a cube, an object, and we have a light source. So I want to show you the difference between direct and indirect clamping. So it's all about the light path. So let's look at that. So by default, direct light is set to 0, indirect light is set to 10. If we're sampling a certain pixel with a creating a light path from the camera that hits the cube here, and then we go out and we're gonna find a light source, and we find this light source. This is a direct light path, and the values can be clamped with this setting. The indirect setting has no effect on these samples. However, if we would have no if we would have no indirect light going on in the scene, then this part of the cube would be completely black. But if we have like another cube, let's duplicate this one and put it somewhere here. Now this cube, this side of the cube would be a little bit lit up slightly by light that hits from the light source, hits this cube, and then reflects back from this cube to this cube, to this side of the cube. And we can see that. So a light path that goes like this hits here, then we can't hit the light source. So it hits some random direction because it's a diffuse material, it can go any direction. And then from here, it goes here. So that's like 1, 2, 3. This is considered indirect. And that's the difference. So and if it's more than 3, it's all indirect. So only paths that take 2 bounces, or actually it's only one bounce, so 2 segments of the path, 1 bounce, is considered direct lighting, and everything more with 2 bounces or more is considered indirect. And so if we take a look at this render, actually we can try this, see what it looks like. And then for this to be accurate, let's turn off the world. So set the world strength to 0. If we would have no object here, let's just remove it. This side of the cube would be completely black. So this side of the cube would be black, and these 2 sides would be grayish. So let's check if that works. It does. And clamping direct would affect these 2 values. Maybe we can do it in live view. So we can see the cube here. Now let's look at clamping. And we're not clamping the direct light, so the clamping the indirect has no effect on the render because we're only seeing direct paths. However, clamping the direct light has an effect. And if we clamp this down to something like 0.1, as you can see, we just make this thing darker. So we don't allow light paths that are above this value to pass through. We actually do allow them to pass through, but we clamp them down. We clamp down the brightness to 0.27, which is like a grayish color. And if you know a little bit about how linear color works, 0 is considered fully black, 1 is considered pure white. So anything above 1 is brighter than white. So you might think, why does a clamping of something above 1 have any effect? Well, that's because it takes the average of all the light samples. So maybe a lot of light samples hit nothing. They hit completely 0 because they hit the world. And then some of them hit the light, which has a brightness of, I don't know, 10. So if 1 sample hits the light, which is 10, and the other 9 samples you take hit 0, the average is going to be 1. So this is going to be a pure white pixel. If you clamp that down to 5, instead of getting the 10, you will get the 1, 5, and then the rest 0, which would result in 0.5. So even a value of clamping above 1 still has a big effect on the final color, even if the color is not above 1, the brightness. So, so the clamping only has an effect, this direct light only has an effect on these 2 parts of the cube, these 2 faces, because this is direct light. We can duplicate the cube, and let's do that. Put it here, and now we have some light coming onto this side of the cube, and the direct light has no effect on this side of the cube. So even if you set this to 0.01, that's very low, almost black, but this part of the cube still gets light because this is not direct, this is indirect, and indirect is being clamped. Well, we could say, let's not clamp it at all, let's set it to 0. This is nothing. Now we still get the original left side of the cube. But if we set the indirect light clamping to something very low, but non-zero, 0.01, we also get a very dark left side of the cube. And now we could turn off direct light. We're only clamping the indirect light. And this makes most sense because usually the indirect light paths are the most noisy. So clamping those has the most positive effect on your final render quality. So yeah, that's pretty much what that's pretty much the difference between direct and indirect light paths. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. One final thing to explain about clamping is how clamping actually works. So we need to know a little bit about how rendering works. So let's remove this first node and let's create another node. See if that works. And I can use this as some kind of graph paper. So if we have if we consider one single pixel, the color of that final pixel is determined by all the samples you take. If we just turn off noise threshold and just have a simple value for our samples, then we're going to take 1024 samples for every pixel. If we just focus on a single pixel in the image, then we can take samples. So this is the amount of samples, and this is the brightness. So some samples are going to be very bright, some samples are not going to be very bright. So let's say we get a sample of this brightness, we get a sample of this brightness, we get a sample of this brightness, and we get 1024 in this case, if this is our sample setting. And now the final value is like, this is the final average. That's going to be the final pixel value. And the more samples you take, the better that average is going to be. Now, if one of those samples is going to be ridiculously bright because there's some bright, tiny light source that affects our pixel, and it's just going through the roof, like way above this, it's gonna skew our final average, and this is what causes those 1 pixel fireflies. This is what causes some pixels to become extremely bright by a very small amount of samples being extremely bright and raising up the entire average of your final brightness. So one way to fix this is just to say, okay, we're just gonna clamp at this value, I don't know, 10. And anything above 10, any sample with a brightness above our clamp value, which is set to 10 by default, for the indirect samples, we're just going to clamp it down to 10. So we consider this brightness as if it were 10 and then use that value for taking the average. And that reduces the average by a lot. And that kind of still makes the pixel a little bit brighter than the rest, but it will be significantly less bright and way easier to denoise, for example. So that's kind of how behind the scenes, how rendering works. Like, it just takes a lot of samples for every single pixel. That's why rendering is so slow. You take 1024 samples for every pixel in the image, and a full HD 1080p image is 2 megapixels, so 2 million pixels times 1,000 samples. If you want to do 4K, it's about 8 megapixel. So that's 8 million times 1,000 is 8 billion samples that we need to take. So that's why rendering can get very slow. And that's pretty much what clamping does behind the scenes. And this is useful to know to make a more educated decision on when to use clamping and when not to use clamping. If you really care about physically accurate renders, then clamping is not a good solution because it makes certain parts of the image less bright than they actually should be. And then if you really need physically accurate renders, you just need to bump up the number of samples. But if you just care about a clean image that looks good, more artistically, then clamping is really good solution to clean up your renders and render more efficiently. Okay, I hope that was useful. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next one.